The rain hit Manhattan hard enough to make the streets look underwater the night I kissed a stranger who could ruin my life with a single phone call. My mascara had already surrendered 20 minutes earlier, black streaks running down my cheeks while I stood outside the Grand Regent Hotel pretending I wasn't falling apart in 5-inch puddles and humiliation. Ethan was inside. Laughing. Drinking $12 whiskey with the blonde woman he'd apparently been seeing for 3 months behind my back. 3 years together, and all it took was one accidental text message lighting up his phone for my entire world to crack open in the middle of Park Avenue. I should have gone home. Any sane woman would have called an Uber, cried into her pillow, maybe blocked his number after 2 glasses of cheap wine. Instead, I stood there in the freezing October rain wearing heels that hurt and a black dress I couldn't afford, staring through the hotel windows like a ghost outside somebody else's life. That's when the black SUV pulled up beside the curb. Smooth. Silent. Expensive enough to probably cost more than my student loans. The back window rolled down halfway, and cigarette smoke drifted into the stormy air. I only saw his hand at first. Large. Steady. A silver watch catching the city lights. Then his voice. Low. Calm. Dangerous in a way my instincts recognized before my brain did. You're standing in the rain on purpose? I turned toward the window, already irritated enough at the universe to make bad decisions. He looked like the kind of man mothers warn daughters about in whispered conversations. Dark hair pushed back neatly. Sharp jawline. Gray eyes colder than the weather. Maybe 35. Italian, probably. Everything about him screamed money and control, from the tailored charcoal coat to the way the driver avoided looking directly at him. I wiped rainwater from my face and laughed once. Bitter. Do I look like I have a plan right now? The corner of his mouth moved slightly. Not quite a smile. More like interest. He held out a lighter through the open window after noticing the unlit cigarette trembling between my fingers. Our hands brushed for half a second. Warm. Skin. Cold rings. Something in my chest tightened unexpectedly. Thanks, I muttered. Across the street, through the glowing hotel windows, I saw Ethan again. His arm around her waist now. Smiling the same smile he used to give me when he thought I was the center of his universe. My stomach twisted so hard it physically hurt. The stranger followed my line of sight once, then looked back at me like he'd already figured everything out. He hurt you, he said simply. Not a question. I hated that he was right. Hated that some stranger in a luxury SUV could read me in 30 seconds when the man I loved hadn't seen me clearly in years. I should have walked away then. Instead, anger climbed into my throat like fire. Wild. Reckless. I stepped closer to the SUV before common sense could stop me. Ethan glanced outside at that exact moment. Our eyes met through the glass. And something inside me snapped. I leaned down, grabbed the stranger gently by the collar, and kissed him. It lasted maybe 3 seconds. Rain on my skin. Cigarette smoke. The sharp scent of expensive cologne. He didn't kiss me back at first. He just froze completely beneath my hands like no one had dared touch him without permission in a very long time. Then I pulled away fast enough to hear my own heartbeat. God! What had I just done? The driver stared forward rigidly. Tension filled the SUV like static before a lightning strike. The stranger looked at me in complete silence. Not shocked. Not amused. Something worse. Focused. His thumb brushed slowly across his lower lip where I'd kissed him. Then he stepped out of the SUV. Tall enough that I had to tilt my head back to meet his eyes. Rain soaked his dark coat instantly, but he didn't seem to notice. Neither did I. He moved closer until the noise of Manhattan faded beneath the sound of my breathing. His fingers wrapped carefully around my wrist. Not painful. Controlled. Possessive enough to make my pulse stumble anyway. Then he lowered his mouth beside my ear and whispered softly, "You have no idea what you just started, Piccola." Behind him, 3 men in black suits stepped out of another SUV like shadows answering to a king. The first thing I saw the next morning was a black car parked across the street from my apartment building. Not moving. Not subtle. Just sitting there beneath the gray New York sky like a warning wrapped in polished metal. I stood frozen behind my tiny kitchen window with cold coffee in my hand and my heartbeat slowly climbing into my throat. Maybe it was a coincidence. Manhattan was full of expensive cars. Full of wealthy men. Full of strangers. But deep down, I already knew coincidences did not look at you like that man had looked at me in the rain. I barely slept after getting home the night before. Every time I closed my eyes, I heard his voice again. Low. Controlled. Too calm for someone who had just been kissed by a reckless stranger outside a hotel. Piccola. The word had followed me home like perfume trapped in fabric. I hated how much I remembered about him. The silver watch. The scar near his chin. The terrifying stillness in his eyes when those men stepped out behind him like they belonged to another world entirely. I kept telling myself he was probably some rich businessman with security. Maybe a politician. Maybe celebrity-level wealthy. Anything except what my instincts whispered at 3 in the morning while I stared at my apartment ceiling unable to breathe normally. Then my phone buzzed. Sarah. Finally alive? Or did Rainboy murder you after that stunt outside the hotel? I almost laughed until another message appeared beneath it. Wait. Turn on the news. My stomach tightened instantly. I grabbed the remote and switched on the television mounted crookedly above my tiny bookshelf. The local morning anchor was talking about some charity gala at the Grand Regent. Then his picture appeared on the screen. The room tilted slightly beneath my feet. Luca Moretti. 34 years old. Real estate investor and owner of Moretti Holdings. The camera showed him stepping out of a courthouse in a dark suit, surrounded by men who looked exactly like the ones from last night. Calm. Untouchable. The kind of man reporters lowered their voices around. Rumors of organized crime connections continue to follow the Manhattan businessmen despite no formal charges being filed. I muted the television immediately. My hands were shaking hard enough to spill coffee across the counter. Organized crime. Oh my God. Oh my God. I kissed a mafia boss. The word sounded ridiculous even inside my own head, like something out of a bad streaming drama. Except nothing about Luca Moretti had felt fictional standing 3 inches away from me in the rain. The knock on my apartment door came at exactly 9:12 in the morning. 3 slow knocks. Controlled. My entire body locked up instantly. I was suddenly hyper-aware of how alone I was. 4th floor walk-up. Broken hallway camera. Tiny apartment with 1 deadbolt that barely worked in winter. Another knock. I moved carefully toward the door and checked through the peephole. A man in a black suit stood outside holding a large white box tied with black ribbon. My pulse stumbled. "Miss Emily Carter," he asked calmly through the door. I did not answer. "Mr. Moretti asked me to deliver this personally." My throat went dry. "I think you have the wrong apartment," I lied quickly. Silence followed for 2 long seconds. Then the man spoke again. "Mr. Moretti does not make mistakes." Something cold moved through my stomach. I should have ignored him. Called the police maybe. Pretended I was not home. Instead, against every intelligent instinct I possessed, I unlocked the door halfway. The man handed me the box politely. No aggression. No threats. Somehow that made it worse. "Have a good day, Miss Carter." He left immediately afterward, footsteps disappearing down the narrow stairwell. I shut the door fast enough to rattle the frame and stared at the box sitting in my hands. Heavy. Expensive. Dangerous in a way I could not explain. Slowly, I untied the ribbon. Inside sat a black umbrella, folded neatly beside a handwritten note in elegant silver ink. New York storms can be unforgiving, Piccola. Beneath the message was a second line that made my blood run cold. Next time, do not stand alone in the rain. I looked toward the window instinctively. The black car was still there. And this time, the driver was watching me. By the third day, I stopped pretending the black cars were a coincidence. They were everywhere. Across the street. From my apartment building in Brooklyn. Parked outside the coffee shop where I studied between shifts. Idling beside the crosswalk near my subway station like silent reminders that somebody was watching me breathe. I told myself I was imagining it at first. Stress. Lack of sleep. Emotional damage from discovering my ex-boyfriend was apparently allergic to loyalty. But paranoia did not explain why the barista at my favorite cafe suddenly started giving me free drinks after whispering nervously to someone on the phone. It did not explain why my landlord fixed the broken heater in my apartment less than 2 hours after I complained for the first time in 6 months. And it definitely did not explain the bouquet waiting outside my door Friday night. Black roses. Real ones. Wrapped in matte paper so expensive it looked like velvet beneath the hallway lights. My stomach dropped the second I saw them. Nobody sends black roses casually. Attached to the stems was another silver note written in the same controlled handwriting that had already started haunting my thoughts. Now they know your face. I read the sentence twice before cold panic slid down my spine. Them. Who exactly was them? I looked down the empty hallway immediately, half expecting somebody to be standing there watching me. Nobody. Just flickering lights and old apartment walls stained with years of cigarette smoke and bad decisions. I grabbed the flowers fast and shoved myself inside my apartment, locking both deadbolts behind me. My hands shook while I reread the note again and again. Now they know your face. The message should have terrified me completely. Instead, a smaller part of me hated how safe it made me feel at the same time. Like somewhere in this massive city full of strangers and noise, one dangerous man had quietly decided I mattered enough to protect. I hated that feeling. Hated him for creating it after one reckless kiss outside a hotel. My phone buzzed against the kitchen counter before I could spiral any further. Unknown number. I stared at it for 3 full rings before answering carefully. Hello. Silence. Then his voice. Smooth as whiskey over ice. You brought the flowers inside. My knees nearly gave out. How did you get this number? I whispered immediately. A low sound came through the line. Not quite laughter. That is your first question. I moved toward my apartment window automatically and parted the blinds just enough to see outside. Another black SUV sat across the street beneath the amber glow of a street lamp. The engine running. Are you watching my building right now? Yes. No hesitation. No apology. The honesty hit harder than denial would have. I pressed my free hand against the counter to steady myself. This is insane. No, Emily. Insane would be leaving you unprotected after what happened at the hotel. My heartbeat stumbled. Nothing happened at the hotel. A lot happened. His voice lowered slightly. Calm. Certain. You kissed me in front of people who pay attention to everything I touch. I swallowed hard. Outside, rain started falling again in thin silver lines across the windshield of the SUV. Manhattan looked colder at night when you knew monsters were real. You are overreacting, I said weakly. Am I? Silence stretched between us for a moment before he spoke again. Look outside your apartment door. Every muscle in my body tightened instantly. What? Open the door, Piccola. My pulse hammered painfully while I walked toward the entrance. Slowly. Quietly. I checked the peephole first. Empty hallway. Nothing there. I cracked the door open carefully and looked down. A small white envelope rested against the floorboards. Fresh. Recently placed. My breath caught. I picked it up with trembling fingers and opened it immediately. Inside was a photograph. Me. Leaving work earlier that afternoon. Someone had circled my face in red ink. Underneath the photo, 3 words were handwritten in jagged black marker. Pretty girl alone. Ice flooded my stomach. I gripped the edge of the doorway so hard my knuckles hurt. Back on the phone, Luca Moretti spoke softly enough to make it worse. Now do you understand why I do not like you standing alone in the rain? Sleep became impossible after the photograph. Every sound outside my apartment made my chest tighten. Every stranger on the subway suddenly looked suspicious. I started checking over my shoulder walking home from work like some paranoid character in a crime documentary, except this was Manhattan and apparently my life had accidentally wandered into the orbit of a man powerful enough to turn fear into something physical. By Sunday night, exhaustion had settled behind my eyes like bruises. I had just finished an 8-hour shift at the jazz lounge downtown, my feet aching inside black heels while tired piano music still echoed in my ears. Rain drizzled lightly over the city again because apparently New York only had 2 moods now. Storming or threatening to storm. I wrapped my coat tighter and pushed through the employee exit into the alley beside the building. The second I stepped outside, I knew something was wrong. The alley was too quiet. No traffic sounds. No laughter from nearby bars. Just cold air and the distant hum of engines somewhere beyond the streetlights. Then footsteps. Fast. Behind me. My entire body locked instantly. I turned sharply, pulse exploding in my throat, only to see a tall man approaching from the shadows wearing a dark hoodie pulled low over his face. "Hey," he called out quickly. "Wait a second." Every survival instinct I had screamed at me to leave. I stepped backward immediately. I do not want any trouble. The man kept walking closer anyway. "Relax. I just want to talk." My heartbeat climbed higher. Somewhere behind me, tires screeched suddenly against wet pavement. A black SUV swung around the alley entrance so fast water sprayed across the concrete. Headlights flooded the narrow space in harsh white light. The man in the hoodie froze instantly. 2 suited men stepped out of the vehicle before I could even process what was happening. Calm. Efficient. Silent. The stranger cursed under his breath and disappeared back into the darkness almost immediately. Just gone. Like prey realizing a larger predator had arrived first. I stood there shaking while the SUV idled beside me, rain tapping softly against polished black paint. Then Luca stepped out of the back seat. Dark coat. Gray eyes. That same terrifying stillness wrapped around him like armor. He looked at me once from head to toe, checking for injuries I did not have, before exhaling slowly through his nose. "You keep making very bad decisions, Emily." Relief hit me so hard it almost embarrassed me. Relief. Because the dangerous man had arrived. What was wrong with me? "Were you following me again?" I whispered. Luca closed the distance between us without answering immediately. "You left work alone after midnight. That is not illegal. Neither is protecting you." His voice stayed calm, but something colder moved beneath the surface tonight. Controlled anger. Not directed at me exactly. At the situation. At whoever had sent that photograph to my apartment. Rain gathered in dark drops along his hair while the city lights reflected silver against his watch. He looked unreal standing there in the alley. Like power dressed in expensive wool. I folded my arms tightly. I cannot live like this. For now, you will. You do not get to decide that. Luca stared at me for a long moment. Quiet. Heavy. Then his eyes shifted toward the alley entrance where the stranger had disappeared. You think men suddenly follow women home by coincidence? I swallowed hard but stayed silent. He stepped closer until I could smell rain and cedarwood cologne again. The moment you kissed me, people started noticing you. Some out of curiosity. Others because they think hurting you would get my attention. The words landed like ice water down my spine. That is insane. This world is insane, Piccola. His hand lifted slowly toward my face and paused for half a second like he was giving me time to pull away. I did not. His fingers brushed a strand of damp hair behind my ear with impossible gentleness for someone carrying this much danger inside him. You are scared, he said quietly. I laughed once. Weak. Congratulations. You finally noticed. Something shifted in his expression then. Small. Almost human beneath all the control. Good, he murmured softly. My eyebrows pulled together immediately. Good. Luca looked directly into my eyes. Fear keeps people alive in my world. The rain intensified around us, drumming harder against the SUV roof while Manhattan blurred silver and gold beyond the alley. Then his driver opened the rear passenger door silently. Luca extended his hand toward me like the choice already belonged to him. Get in the car, Emily. I stared at him for 2 dangerous heartbeats. And if I say no? His gaze lowered briefly to my trembling hands before returning to my face. Then I stand here in the rain with you until you stop pretending you are not already under my protection. The inside of Luca Moretti's SUV smelled like leather, rain, and expensive cologne strong enough to feel dangerous all by itself. I sat stiffly against the black leather seat while Manhattan blurred outside the tinted windows in streaks of gold and silver. Nobody spoke for the first 5 minutes. Not Luca. Not the driver. Not the 2 men in suits following behind us in another vehicle like shadows attached to his existence. The silence should have felt awkward. Instead, it felt heavy. Controlled. Like even conversation inside this car belonged to him. I kept staring out the window because looking directly at Luca for too long made my heartbeat act embarrassingly unreliable. He sat beside me with one arm resting against the door, dark coat still damp from the rain, his attention fixed calmly on the city passing outside. Completely composed. Meanwhile I was one emotional breakdown away from needing therapy for the rest of my 20s. Finally, I crossed my arms tighter and looked at him. So what now? Luca glanced toward me slowly. Now you stop walking home alone. That is not an answer. It is the only one that matters tonight. I exhaled sharply through my nose. You cannot just decide to take over someone's life because they kissed you one time. Something almost amused flickered in his gray eyes. Almost. You still think this is about the kiss. Then what is it about? He stayed quiet for a moment before reaching into the inner pocket of his coat. My stomach tightened immediately. He pulled out another photograph and handed it to me carefully. I hesitated before taking it. The image showed me leaving my apartment building yesterday morning carrying coffee and headphones. Someone had taken it from across the street. The realization made my skin go cold instantly. How many of these are there? I whispered. Enough. I stared at the picture too long, my pulse thudding painfully against my ribs. Who is doing this? Luca looked out the window again before answering. Men who would like my attention. And they think using me will get it? Yes. His honesty hit harder every single time. No sugarcoating. No fake reassurance. Just truth delivered calmly enough to make it terrifying. I rubbed my hands together nervously. This is insane. I am nobody. Luca's gaze shifted back to me immediately. Sharp. Focused. You became somebody the second you stood beside me publicly. The words settled heavily in the air between us. Outside, Times Square exploded with neon lights and crowded sidewalks, but inside the SUV everything felt strangely disconnected from normal life. Like I had stepped through an invisible door the night I kissed him and accidentally wandered into another world entirely. My phone suddenly buzzed inside my purse. Ethan. Of course. I nearly ignored it until Luca glanced down at the screen lighting up beside me. His expression did not change at all. Somehow that made me more nervous. You should answer, he said calmly. Why? Because men who betray you usually panic when they realize someone else noticed your value first. I stared at him. That is an incredibly intense thing to say. Luca lifted one shoulder slightly. Does it make me wrong? Unfortunately, no. Ethan had spent the last 48 hours sending apology texts long enough to qualify as emotional hostage situations. I declined the call immediately. Luca watched me for half a second longer than necessary. Good choice. Heat climbed unexpectedly into my cheeks and I hated myself for it. To distract myself, I looked out the windshield again just as the SUV slowed in front of a massive stone building glowing softly against the rainy night sky. My breath caught instantly. The place looked less like an apartment building and more like the kind of residence old money families passed down through generations along with emotional repression and trust funds. Security stood outside beneath black umbrellas. The second our vehicle stopped moving, they opened the gates. Automatically. I turned toward Luca so fast my hair brushed my shoulder. Why are we here? Because you are exhausted. That does not answer the question either. Luca leaned slightly closer then, close enough that his voice dropped lower without becoming softer. You are staying somewhere safe tonight, Emily. My stomach flipped immediately. Absolutely not. One corner of his mouth moved faintly. Dangerous. Patient. You keep saying no like it changes what happens next. Before I could argue again, the SUV doors opened from outside. Rain spilled cold air into the car while security waited silently beside us. Luca stepped out first, then extended his hand toward me without hesitation. Not demanding. Certain. Like somewhere deep down he already knew I would take it eventually. And the worst part was I was not completely sure he was wrong anymore. The penthouse looked like the kind of place people lied about owning on social media. Floor-to-ceiling windows stretched across half of Manhattan, rain sliding down the glass while the city glowed beneath us in gold and white lights. Everything inside felt expensive in a quiet way. Dark marble floors. Black leather furniture. Artwork that probably cost more than my yearly rent hanging beneath soft amber lighting. Even the silence sounded wealthy. I stood near the entrance still wearing my damp coat while Luca removed his watch slowly beside the windows like this entire situation was completely normal to him. Meanwhile my nervous system had officially given up cooperating 3 panic attacks ago. I am not staying here, I said for what felt like the 50th time that night. Luca loosened the cuffs of his black shirt calmly without looking at me. You are tired. That is not the issue. You are frightened. His gray eyes finally lifted toward me. Sharp enough to pin people in place without effort. That is the issue. I folded my arms tightly across my chest. You cannot solve everything by surrounding it with security guards and expensive walls. Something unreadable crossed his face for half a second. Then he walked toward the kitchen without responding immediately. Have you eaten? I blinked at him. What? Dinner, Emily. He opened a cabinet and pulled out a glass with movements so precise they almost looked rehearsed. Have you eaten? The question caught me off guard in the worst possible way. Nobody had asked me that gently in weeks. Maybe months. I hated that my throat tightened because of it. Not since work. Luca nodded once like he already expected that answer. 10 minutes later, I sat awkwardly at a marble kitchen island eating homemade pasta prepared by a private chef I had not even seen enter the apartment. The entire situation felt surreal. 1 minute I had been terrified in a rainy alley. Now I was eating truffle ravioli in a Mafia boss's penthouse while he poured sparkling water like some emotionally unavailable billionaire from a streaming drama. My life had taken a truly aggressive left turn. Luca leaned against the counter across from me, sleeves rolled slightly past his wrists now. Without the coat and gloves and rain, he somehow looked even more dangerous. More real. Dark hair slightly messy. Sharp jawline shadowed from exhaustion. A faint scar near his left hand I had not noticed before. Human details hidden beneath all that control. "Why are you looking at me like that?" he asked suddenly. Heat rushed to my face immediately. "I am not." One dark eyebrow lifted slightly. "Piccola." I looked down at my plate so fast I almost hated myself. Luca Moretti noticed everything. Silence settled again between us, softer this time. Less tense. Rain tapped steadily against the windows while jazz music played quietly somewhere deeper in the penthouse. Finally, I set my fork down carefully. "Can I ask you something?" "You are going to ask anyway." "Fair point." I took a breath. "Why me?" Luca stayed very still at the question. "You barely know me." His gaze held mine across the kitchen island. Calm. Heavy. "I know enough. You do not even know my favorite color." "Blue." I froze. "What?" "You wear it when you want to feel calm." My stomach flipped unexpectedly. Luca pushed away from the counter slowly and walked toward the windows overlooking the city. "You bite the inside of your cheek when you are nervous. You stop making eye contact when you are lying. You play piano softer when you are sad even though most people at the lounge never notice." Every word landed carefully. Deliberately. My pulse became impossible to ignore. "You have been watching me." "Yes." No shame. No apology. Just truth again. I stood from the stool slowly. That should scare me more than it does. Luca turned toward me then, city lights reflecting silver in his eyes. It probably should. The honesty almost made me smile despite myself. Almost. Then something shifted beyond the windows behind him. A flash of movement from the building across the street. Luca noticed it instantly. The softness disappeared from his face so quickly it startled me. His entire body changed in 1 second. Still. Focused. Dangerous. He crossed the room toward me immediately. "Stay away from the windows." My heartbeat stumbled. What happened? He did not answer right away. Instead, he gently but firmly moved me behind him while one of his security men suddenly entered the penthouse from another room speaking quietly into an earpiece. Tension flooded the apartment so fast the air itself seemed heavier. Luca kept his eyes fixed on the dark building across the street before speaking softly enough to make my blood run cold. "Somebody found out where you are." The air inside the penthouse changed instantly after Luca spoke those 6 words. "Somebody found out where you are." Fear moved through the room like invisible smoke. Quiet. Fast. The security man near the doorway touched his earpiece again while another appeared from the hallway carrying the kind of calm expression people only learned after living around danger too long. Meanwhile my heartbeat was trying to physically escape my body. Luca stayed directly in front of me, one arm slightly extended behind him like some instinct inside him had already decided I belonged under his protection. The realization should have terrified me more than it did. "What does that mean?" I whispered. Luca kept his eyes on the building across the street. "It means somebody is testing boundaries." "Testing whose boundaries?" His jaw tightened faintly. "Mine." The answer landed heavily in the room. I looked toward the rain-streaked windows instinctively, but Luca's hand found my wrist before I could step closer. Warm. Firm. Immediate. "Do not." His voice stayed calm, but I felt the warning beneath it. I froze automatically. Luca looked down at my wrist still held gently in his hand. Then his grip loosened slightly like he had just realized he touched me without thinking first. "Sorry," he said quietly. The apology surprised me more than anything else tonight. Mafia bosses in expensive penthouses apparently apologized now. What a confusing timeline this had become. One of the security men approached carefully. "The vehicle is gone." Luca nodded once. "Keep monitoring the building." The man disappeared again without another word. Silence settled over the penthouse after that, thick enough to feel. Rain hammered harder against the windows while distant thunder rolled across Manhattan like the city itself was warning me to run. Instead, I stood there staring at Luca Moretti trying to understand how one impulsive kiss had somehow rewritten my entire life in less than a week. "You should not have brought me here," I said softly. Luca finally looked at me fully then. Gray eyes. Exhausted eyes. Human eyes despite everything dangerous underneath them. There is nowhere safer in New York tonight. That is not exactly comforting considering who owns this place. Something almost like amusement touched his mouth briefly. "Fair." I exhaled shakily and crossed my arms tighter. "I do not understand this world, Luca." The sound of his first name in my voice changed something in the room. Tiny. Immediate. His gaze sharpened slightly while my pulse betrayed me all over again. Dangerous man. Dangerous eyes. Dangerous effect on my nervous system. "You are not supposed to understand it," he said quietly. "You are supposed to stay away from it." I laughed once under my breath. Bit late for that. Luca stared at me for 2 long seconds before looking away toward the windows again. Yes. The honesty in that single word hit harder than dramatic speeches would have. I moved toward the kitchen slowly, needing distance from the intensity surrounding him. My fingers wrapped around the edge of the marble counter. While I tried calming my breathing. "Can I ask you something without you getting mysterious and emotionally unavailable?" That actually pulled a small real smile from him. Brief. Sharp. Beautiful enough to feel unfair. Probably not. But ask anyway. I looked at him carefully. Why do they care so much? Luca stayed silent. I could almost see him deciding how much truth to give me. Finally, he spoke. Because people like me survive through reputation. Meaning? He walked closer slowly. Controlled. People fear what they think I protect. My stomach tightened immediately. And now they think you are protecting me. I am protecting you. The certainty in his voice stole the air from my lungs for half a second. No hesitation. No confusion. Just truth again. Outside, lightning flashed across the skyline bright enough to illuminate the entire penthouse silver-white for one sharp moment. Luca looked almost dangerous enough to belong to the storm itself. You barely know me, I whispered. He stopped directly in front of me then. Close enough that my heartbeat became impossible to ignore. I know that when you are frightened, you still try to pretend you are brave. His voice lowered softer. I know you keep saying no even when your hands shake. My throat tightened unexpectedly. Luca's gaze dropped briefly to my mouth before lifting again. Controlled. Restrained. Somehow that felt more intense than if he had actually touched me. And I know, he murmured carefully, that part of you stopped wanting to run the moment you realized I would never let anything happen to you. The room went completely still around us. My breathing caught somewhere between panic and something far more dangerous. Then suddenly every light in the penthouse shut off at once. Darkness swallowed the room instantly. Somewhere down the hallway, an alarm started beeping softly. And beside me, Luca Moretti became terrifyingly still. Darkness changes people when it arrives suddenly enough. 1 second I was standing inches away from Luca Moretti trying not to drown in the way he looked at me. The next, the entire penthouse vanished into black silence broken only by the sharp electronic beeping. Somewhere down the hallway. My breath caught instantly. Outside, thunder rolled across Manhattan while rain lashed violently against the windows. Then Luca's hand found mine in the dark. Immediate. Steady. Protective before I even realized I was afraid. "Stay behind me," he said quietly. His voice had changed again. Colder now. Sharper. The version of him the city whispered about after midnight. Somewhere deeper in the penthouse, footsteps moved quickly. Low voices. Security speaking into radios. I could barely see anything except the faint silver outline of lightning flashing through the windows every few seconds. Luca moved closer until I could feel the heat from his body beside mine. "Do not leave this room unless I tell you to." My fingers tightened around his instinctively before I could stop myself. "Luca." Another flash of lightning illuminated his face for half a second. Calm. Focused. Terrifyingly composed. "Look at me, Emily." I did. "Nothing is going to happen to you tonight." The certainty in his voice settled something panicked inside my chest even while alarms continued echoing through the apartment. Somewhere along the line, my body had started believing him before my brain could catch up. One of the security men appeared from the hallway carrying a flashlight. "Backup generators are coming online now. Security breach on the lower level." My stomach dropped instantly. Security breach? Luca did not even blink. "How many?" "Unknown." The man handed Luca the flashlight carefully. "Garage cameras were disabled for 30 seconds. 30 seconds. That was all it took to make the atmosphere inside the penthouse feel dangerous enough to breathe differently." Luca nodded once toward the hallway. "Double the security upstairs." The man disappeared immediately. Silence rushed back in afterward except for the storm outside. Then emergency lights flickered softly overhead, painting the penthouse in dim amber shadows instead of total darkness. I finally let go of Luca's hand slowly, only realizing then how tightly I had been holding on. His eyes dropped briefly toward our hands before lifting back to my face. Something unreadable moved through his expression. "You should sit down," he said quietly. "I am not going to faint." "No. But you are shaking." I looked down immediately. He was right. My hands would not stop trembling. Luca guided me gently toward the sofa near the windows, keeping himself positioned between me and the hallway the entire time like instinct refused to let him do otherwise. I sat slowly while he remained standing nearby, one hand resting against the back of the couch. Watching everything. Listening to everything. "Is this normal for you?" I asked softly after a long silence. Luca looked toward the rain-soaked skyline outside. "Unfortunately." "That is a terrifying answer." A faint tired smile touched his mouth for barely a second. "You are learning quickly." Another rumble of thunder shook the windows lightly. I wrapped my arms around myself and looked at him carefully beneath the dim emergency lights. Without the polished calm he usually wore, Luca suddenly looked exhausted. Not physically. Emotionally. Like carrying this kind of power had slowly hollowed pieces out of him over time. "You cannot keep living like this forever," I whispered before thinking. His gaze shifted toward me slowly. "Men like me do not usually get forever." The quiet honesty in that sentence hurt more than it should have. Before I could answer, one of the televisions mounted across the penthouse suddenly flickered back to life with the emergency power. Breaking news filled the screen immediately. A photograph of Luca appeared beside bold red headlines while reporters spoke urgently over footage of police lights downtown. I turned toward the television fully just as the anchor spoke his name. "Authorities continue investigating tonight after an anonymous tip linked businessman Luca Moretti to an ongoing federal organized crime inquiry." My stomach tightened instantly. More footage appeared. Black SUVs. Security teams. Men in suits entering buildings beneath camera flashes. The city did not see the man who asked if I had eaten dinner. They saw a monster wrapped in expensive fabric. I looked back toward Luca automatically. He was already watching me instead of the television. Calm. Waiting. Like he had seen this exact moment happen before with other people. The moment fear usually won. Emily, he said softly. If you want to leave after tonight, I will let you. Lightning flashed across the penthouse again, illuminating his face silver white against the storm outside. Dangerous man. Dangerous world. Dangerous heart hidden somewhere beneath all that control. And for the first time since this nightmare started, I realized something far more terrifying than the headlines on television. I did not want to leave. The storm finally started calming around 3 in the morning. Manhattan still glowed beneath the penthouse windows, washed silver by rain and sleeplessness, but the thunder had faded into distant echoes somewhere beyond the river. The emergency lights were gone now. Security had stopped moving through the hallways every 5 seconds. Even the city itself seemed exhausted. I sat curled beneath a cashmere blanket on Luca's enormous sofa pretending I was not watching him from across the room. He stood near the windows with one hand in his pocket and the other holding a glass of untouched whiskey, dark suit jacket gone now, black shirt slightly wrinkled from the longest night of my life. Somehow he looked more dangerous exhausted than perfectly composed. More human too. Which honestly felt riskier. The television had been muted for almost an hour, but his face still glowed silently across the screen beside words like investigation and organized crime and federal inquiry. A man the city feared. A man powerful enough to make people disappear from conversations the second his name appeared. And somehow also the same man who noticed when my hands shook and made sure I ate dinner. I still had not figured out how both versions could exist inside one person at the same time. You should try sleeping, Luca said quietly without turning around. I blinked. How did you know I was awake? A faint smile touched his mouth. You sigh every 30 seconds when you are pretending to rest. Heat climbed unexpectedly into my cheeks. Luca finally looked over his shoulder at me then, gray eyes softer now in the dim light. Less boss. More man. The realization made my pulse shift strangely. Again. Dangerous. Always dangerous. Come here, he said after a moment. Every intelligent survival instinct I possessed should have screamed no immediately. Instead, I stood up slowly and crossed the penthouse toward him while rain tapped softly against the windows beside us. Luca watched me the entire way there. Calm. Focused. Like I was the only thing in the room worth paying attention to. I stopped beside him near the glass overlooking Manhattan. 30 floors below us, headlights moved through the streets like rivers of light. The city never slept. Neither did men like Luca Moretti apparently. Why are you still awake? I asked softly. Luca looked back out at the skyline. Because people are trying to scare you tonight. The answer hit my chest harder than expected. You cannot protect me every second. I can try. His voice stayed quiet. Honest. I stared at him carefully. Why does that matter so much to you? Luca stayed silent long enough that I thought he would avoid the question completely. Then he looked down at the glass in his hand instead of at me. Because you kissed me like I was normal. My breath caught slightly. He laughed once under his breath after saying it. Not amused. More surprised by himself than anything else. Do you know how long it has been since somebody touched me without wanting something from me? The vulnerability hidden inside that sentence made my chest ache unexpectedly. Luca finally looked at me then. No walls. No control. Just exhaustion and something dangerously close to loneliness sitting behind his eyes. You looked at me in the rain like I was just a man standing there, he said softly. Not a reputation. Not a weapon. Not a monster people whisper about after midnight. The city lights reflected silver across the windows around us while my heartbeat slowly forgot how to function normally. Maybe, I whispered carefully, you stopped being a monster for a minute. Something shifted across his face then. Small. Real. Like nobody had ever said something like that to him before. Luca stepped closer slowly until barely any space remained between us. I could feel warmth radiating from him despite the storm-chilled glass. Behind me. Piccola, he murmured quietly, you are very dangerous for someone who thinks she is ordinary. My pulse stumbled hard. He lifted one hand slowly toward my face, giving me every opportunity to pull away again. I did not. His fingers brushed softly against my cheek, impossibly gentle for a man carrying this much darkness inside him. Then his forehead rested lightly against mine while Manhattan glittered beneath us like another universe entirely. No fear. No panic. Just the steady terrifying realization that somewhere between the black cars and the rainstorms and the whispered warnings, I had stopped wanting to escape him. Luca closed his eyes briefly before speaking one last time, his voice low enough to belong only to me. The first time you kissed me, you started a war inside my life. His thumb brushed softly along my cheekbone. If you kiss me again, Emily, I do not think there will be any part of me left untouched by you. And standing there wrapped in the arms of the most dangerous man in New York while rain painted silver lines across the glass around us, I realized the truly terrifying thing was not that Luca Moretti could ruin my life. It was that I was no longer sure I would stop him.